Commercial awareness. It's a wonderful skill, an indispensable skill for that matter, for anyone who's trying to make it to one of the largest law firms in the world, because it helps you understand how law firms work, how businesses work, and how you can contribute practically to your clients. But who to learn this from? Probably someone who has an experience with commercial law, someone who has made it to one of the largest law firms in the world, and someone who keeps having these conversations through a wonderful podcast called More from Law. Ladies and gentlemen, joining me in this podcast today is Mr. Harry Clark. Harry is a future trainee solicitor for Baker McKenzie. He is the host of a wonderful podcast called More from Law. I absolutely love More from Law. The episodes add so much value to my perceptions. They keep teaching me about commercial law and multiple such aspects. In this episode, Harry and I are going to talk about his journey through law school. We are also going to talk about his journey to Baker McKenzie, the concept that is commercial awareness, how can we build commercial awareness and how we can use it in the real world. If you like this idea, stay tuned till the very end of the episode. If you like this episode, make sure you like, share and subscribe. If you have any suggestions, feedbacks, make sure you reach out to me. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, let's start the One Take Show. Hello, Harry. Welcome to the One Take Show. I am so happy to have you on my podcast. I have been a fan of your podcast. More from Law is obviously a benchmark that we all try to live up to. And absolutely, it's a beautiful venture of yours because I get to listen to such amazing conversations with such great people from around the world. So thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me and talk about commercial awareness and your journey with law.
No, it's my pleasure, and what a flattering intro, I have to say. But thank you for inviting me on.
Well, before we begin and start talking about commercial awareness, if we start talking about your podcast, I would love to know a little bit about your journey. I think it's been a very interesting journey with law. What inspired you to take up law in the very first place? And what were the standout experiences in law school and how did you go about it?
Yeah, so I guess that kind of initial why law question, kind of stemmed when I was sort of doing my studies when I was about 16 years old, and I was doing a lot of the kind of what you call essay subjects, so English, politics, and government, and I kind of really liked the idea of argumentation and understanding the kind of reasoning behind people's arguments and kind of persuasive writing, all that stuff, which I think kind of really lends itself nicely to lawyers because they obviously love to argue and. It was only the kind of cherry on top, I guess, was the fact that I didn't really like maths, and so I thought that's kind of what pushed me down the law route for university. And then when I sort of started to learn a little bit more about law, both at uni and in the leading up to it, I sort of did two kind of work experiences that I think were really quite influential in deciding what area of law I wanted to practice in, because obviously law is this huge beast and there's so much to it. And the first one was a family law sort of placement I did for a week, sort of shadowing a solicitor and learning about what it is that lawyers do, because it was my first time seeing it in person, actually experiencing it. And I loved the idea of how lawyers are there to kind of fix problems and problem solving and, going away, researching a question or something and then presenting it to a client in some way. And that was the element of law I really kind of fell in love with. And then when I did my second placement at a more commercially focused firm, it was seeing how that kind of element of problem solving fit in the world of business and kind of had a real international context to it that kind of really struck a nerve. And then I think ever since then, I was just looking to learn more about that kind of internationally focused, business-minded sense of law. And yeah, that ultimately led to me applying to Baker McKenzie and securing my training contract there as well. So that's kind of how my motivations, I guess, have sort of developed over time.
Right. With your training contract with Baker McKenzie, was there any specific strategy that you've used? Because obviously it's a very reputable opportunity that you've had and requires a lot of hard work and strategic planning. So was there any strategy that you've used?
Not at first. So I kind of did 3 rounds of applications. I did my first towards the end of my first year, and then my final one was just before I started my final year at university. And when I started out, I had no strategy, or at least I had a very bad one, which was to write very generic answers and just go for quantity and kind of, I don't know if I was mirroring it from what I might have seen siblings do in different careers or kind of just my own understanding of that's what job search process was like. You send your CV off and you get the interview, but obviously I think applying for training contracts and vacation schemes and other positions in law are incredibly different because they're so competitive and because they have this sort of tailored mechanism of writing applications and things like that. So I started off with no strategy, which probably went as well as you could expect, and got abundance of rejections. And then I think between my kind of second and third rounds, my actual academics or my experience didn't change too much, but certainly my approach and strategy did. And what that primarily involved was, at the research stage, really getting down a really kind of good understanding of what that firm was about. So, not only why did I want to apply to, say, a commercial firm with international kind of element or leaning, getting down to those kind of supplementary reasons as well. So what is it about the way that trading contract was structured, or the secondment opportunities, or the different kind of pro bono initiatives they might offer that really kind of helps me differentiate between those similar firms. And once I kind of got that research stage down, it really helps with the rest of your application, because that's ultimately what you base a lot of your writing and your motivations on in those later stages. And then in all honesty, I think just on the writing side of things, when it came to my later interviews as well, I took all the things that I'd learned from getting things wrong the first time round and used those to kind of reflect on my approach the next time round, which was ultimately much more successful as a strategy. So yeah, I don't think there's a kind of magic bullet formula to always follow for these kind of things. I think there's certainly advice and things to avoid, which is why I do my best to kind of provide whenever I talk on those topics. But I think, kind of learning from your own experiences and certainly avoiding some of the mistakes I did is what I would call a good strategy to sort of follow.
Well, your experience does speak for itself. There's very interesting thing that you just pointed out, that you had to go through repeated attempts as well as a proper planning for the same. This must have given you an idea as to what are the essential skills that, let's say, law students or fresh legal aspirants can try to inculcate in their personalities or in their credentials, so as to become more conducive to such employment opportunities. So what are those basic skill sets that you might have recognized?
Yeah, so if you'd have asked me this back when I was at university, or before I kind of had, I guess, a real exposure to speaking to lawyers and learning about the profession, I probably would have said, well, obviously it's your understanding of the law, it's your ability to tell, what is the legal position on every given scenario. And that is obviously still important. But I think it fundamentally undervalues and underappreciates every other element that there is to practicing law. And I've learnt that through speaking to lawyers from multiple jurisdictions and multiple different kind of practice areas and different roles and so on. So, the ability to do that kind of back office work, understand the law, understand, what section of what act fits where, and the kind of legal landscape is really important. But there's this whole other side to things, which is the ability to, convey information in a simple way to a client that might be a particularly complex issue, or the ability to hopefully win new clients for the firm and to kind of market and do some business development and understand that law is ultimately sales and how you're keeping your clients happy and hopefully winning new ones. And commercial awareness and all these other kind of buzzwords that you hear, they are really important. And I think if I were to list it down to perhaps 3, setting aside that legal research thing aside, based on what I've heard from speaking to people, it's that commercial awareness, it's putting your clients' needs into context, it's an awareness of business development, so how do firms kind of operate as businesses and win new clients, and then finally just kind of that core kind of fundamental idea of empathy, of being able to understand the client's position and resonate with it and take things from their perspective as well as your own, and understand other stakeholders. So not an exhaustive list, but certainly 3 things to keep in mind, I think.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because obviously these skills are now being really valued by the employee-employer relationships are now changing with the times, and now the entire game is now evolving into a different level. This brings me to one of your very interesting ventures that I've really personally benefited a lot from. It's more from law. That podcast, you get into conversation with some really amazing people who talk about some outstanding subjects. I mean, the idea itself is so inducive, it's so cherishing. I would love to know a little bit about the principle behind this podcast. How do you go about, what was the principle behind this? What do you intend on conveying through this podcast? And where do you see this podcast going in the near future?
Yeah, good question. I think it goes back a little bit to my previous answer in terms of wanting to shine a light on what practice is actually like. I think there's a lot of elements of practicing law and the qualification route, for example, that aren't as transparent as they could be to aspiring lawyers, and I've yet to find a good reason as to why that's potentially the case. And I think it also goes hand in hand with the idea that for a lot of people, your access to career service, your access to guidance, your access to mentoring, or the ability to speak with recruiters or founders or CEOs, influencers, all these kind of people is obviously extremely limited and is based on a whole myriad of factors. And I thought, well, I've been very fortunate to kind of meet these people and have a very kind of information and value rich network. And I thought if I can do my best to sort of disseminate and spread that information to as many people as possible, then that's what I wanted to do, and to not only do so in a way which is primarily focused in one area or one paradigm of law, of commercial law, for example, but to really open it up, because I was guilty of this when I first started the podcast, and I'm doing my best to kind of unlearn it. But my interest is in commercial law, perhaps with an international element, and so it's very easy for that to be my sole focus of law and what it's all about. But I think the more I've spoken to students and aspiring lawyers, and people say, look, I really don't know what I want to do, I just know I want to do something within the legal profession, that's when it's about, okay, I need to open up to what is it that barristers do, what is it that mediators might do, or even just thinking even more broadly, what are the kind of skills and complementary skill sets that lawyers might need, the ability to network or market or negotiate, for example. I think it was just about trying to kind of provide that all-encompassing resource for people who are either wanting to figure out what they want to do in law, or even who are right through and already practicing the profession, who can hopefully learn something new as well. So I think going forward, just hopefully expanding that, continuing to kind of make sure that all bases are covered as much as possible in terms of anyone who wants to can learn something new from the podcast, and to see where it goes. In all honesty, I a lot of my ventures and stuff, I don't go in there with a kind of 2-year plan that this is where it's going to be. At the end of it, it's more a case of, well, I'll try it, I'll see what works, what doesn't, what opportunities come up along the way, and if I can, I'll seize them.
Right. This is quite very inspiring as well, because now this is a very selfish question. Let me just come off clean. I would love to know about, have you made certain mistakes? I won't say mistakes, but learning points while interviewing your guests or going about your podcast or learning about people's experiences that might have changed your approach towards your podcast, or would have transformed the way you either produce podcast, or you plan podcast, or you look at your guests or invite guests any way possible?
Yeah, I think there's probably two. I think the first one would be, like I kind of hinted at, is kind of challenging my own biases and my own kind of tendency to lean towards an area of law, and kind of not always being able to kind of step back and realize that it's not everyone wants to be a commercial solicitor, and law is such a huge area of practice, and there's so many different kind of roles and responsibilities and jurisdictions and whatnot that you can practice in. So I think that's been one of the things that I've slowly learned, and hopefully trying to kind of do by speaking to barristers, speaking to more diverse kind of ranges of people from all kinds of different backgrounds. So that's certainly been one. And I think the second was just interviewing style. But I think in all honesty, that kind of extends to any project that you do, that your first attempt will never be perfect and will almost always be terrible. And so trying to avoid trying to overly script the conversation, or almost preparing too extensively and deviating just slightly would kind of, in your mind, derail the whole podcast. I think instead kind of viewing things as much more of a flexible conversation, a give and take, and not making things too formalized was something that I think you can hopefully notice. I think wherever I am now, episode 30, compared to especially episode 1 or 2, when it's much more kind of scripted and on the rails. So I think those are probably the two things that I've learned so far, and probably many more to come as well in future.
Well, I'll take those two things and I will carefully note them down so that I can start using them in my podcast. But it's very fantastic to know that you've helped a lot of people. Let's accept the fact that there are a lot of people who really benefit from your various ventures that you come out with. I mean, we'll talk about various things that you are now going to start or already are working with. I continuously keep seeing regular LinkedIn posts where they either commend you or thank you for their various achievements or learnings. But there's one area that you've really somehow propagated and have brought into light, that is commercial awareness. And you've talked about commercial awareness on multiple instances, how it helps the legal professionals as well as the aspirants. and how it helps the law firms, and how it helps us steer this career path of ours. So I would love to know, what exactly do you mean by commercial awareness, and how do we understand what commercial awareness should be?
Yeah, it's a question that I get a lot, and I think it's a bit frustrating because students have a really hard time, conceptualizing it if they've not been exposed to the term before, or defining it. And if you go on Google, you find like 10 different definitions, and everyone says it's really important, but no one really knows what it is. And I think I've always kind of struggled to kind of put a concrete definition on it. But I think if I can describe it in a way which is probably most kind of simplistic, or at least in a way which most people will be able to refer to, it's context. If a client comes to you and says, look, I need X, I'm trying to achieve X, I'm trying to franchise a new business in another country, for example. So the initial kind of surface level approach for a lawyer will be, okay, well then there's clearly a number of legal obstacles that we need to consider here. We need to consider the potential commercial or corporate law here, we need to consider the employment law here, the IP law here, and there will be a variety of legal advice you would give on that basis. The law is XYZ, or allows you to do XYZ. But of course, that's not what clients pay lawyers for. And the more I've spoken to lawyers, I think the more that's really kind of been drilled into me. It's that the client isn't coming to you and saying, can you tell me what section 27 of this act says? Because that's legalese, right. It's not English, and it doesn't help them solve their problem. And I think where commercial awareness comes in is being able to put everything into context. So the client comes to you and obviously says, I need to franchise that, but they say, look, I've got this kind of budget, or I need to account for this kind of time frame, or I'm doing it in this country and I'm not used to this market before, or I'm doing it in liaison with this other industry or this other country. And it's your job as the lawyer to go, okay, well, I know that you've technically got these legal options available to you, but I'm now going to walk you through the process of which one is commercially, or in other words, based on your context and your specific needs, the ones which are most viable, or perhaps the most risk averse, or something like that. And you draw that context based on not just your own experience, but your understanding of this kind of global kind of context to the news, or kind of commercial developments, or developments within your own industry, and especially your own understanding of the firm itself as a business. So based on what a client is saying to you, you might say, well, look, I can provide you this kind of fixed price solution, or I know that based on our own internal workings, this is the kind of package we're going to put together for you, or this is how I, as a trainee, am going to add value to a role, and this is how the partner will do his job. I think it's about kind of balancing those two things: the external understanding of what's going on around you and how it will relate to the problem, but also your own internal understanding of how the firm is running as a business, and how it will be looking to innovate and kind of develop new solutions, and ultimately provide them in a way which is accessible to clients as well.
Right. At this point, I'm going to ask you a rather naive question, because I think everyone who listens to this conversation will obviously have a question. Most importantly, the law students would have this question as to how can we develop this commercial awareness. I mean, obviously, you talk about being aware about your law firm, or the law firm that you're targeting to work for, what activities they engage with, or what are the circumstances around. But is there a particular roadmap through which we can very systematically or categorically work in order to improve this commercial awareness, or very consciously try and direct our attention towards this field?
Yeah, I think a good way to conceptualize this is, obviously, like you said, the news stories and the understanding of what's going on in the world is probably one of the most fundamental kind of starting points. You need to be aware of what's going on before you can begin to analyze it through some kind of methodology. And I think a really kind of helpful way to think of it is think of it as a habit. I'm going to spend 10 minutes a day just flicking through headlines, if that, newspapers. Start really small and just think, I'm going to do this for the sake of a week or two, and then hopefully that will help me give at least a rough idea of what's going on. And then over time, you want to get to the point where our habits are a vast majority of our actions. It's just all an automatic. And if you can build in the ability to check the news and keep up to date with everything that's going on as part of a habit, and a kind of a good one at that, a consistent one, then that's a really good kind of fundamental starting point to begin with. So start small and begin to kind of over time develop it and diversify what you're doing and finding new ways to do so. Right. And then I think once you've kind of built that initial information provision, and you're able to understand a little bit what's going on, then it becomes about analyzing it and understanding the actual significance, the kind of so what, what's the bottom line behind this story, or what does this really mean? And I think that comes much more down to your kind of analysis and your perspective. So you've got commercial awareness as the habit for information provision, and now you're thinking about it as a perspective or a way to approach things. And there are a number of different models which have historically been proposed. I think SWOT and PESTLE acronyms are obviously really popular. Porter's 5 Forces as a way to analyze industries. There are countless kind of sociological or economic ways to analyze a problem, but I think a good friend, Peter Watson, had a good example or idea to start with, which is just mind mapping. So get this one story and figure out who are all the different parties that are involved, who's immediately involved, who's perhaps indirectly involved, and what are all the different stakeholder interests, and plot them out. And that will give you a good example of kind of how big the story is or where it's reaching and so on. And then once you've been able to kind of summarize that story or the significance on say one page, or you can quickly, succinctly explain it in 30 seconds, then you can begin to understand how a story that happens in one industry might impact another story in another, and how these different stories are kind of connecting together, for example. And once you begin to kind of think that, and you can kind of synthesize all these different events happening together, you'll be able to understand what are the kind of longer running trends here. So in the short term, the immediate impact is going to be this, but long term, is this indicative of a change in consumer behavior, or is this something we have to look out for in future? So yeah, I think that just kind of starting small with the information provision, then start to think critically about, so what, why is this here, and who is it affecting? And then once you've kind of really gotten comfortable with that, then you can begin to bring together your analysis into a more kind of group sort of methodology, and really understand the importance and significance of stories kind of coming together in trends over time.
Right. Because I think what you brought up, mind mapping, is very useful. It's really catching a lot of traction these days, and as you have described it very succinctly, is that we can actually use it to somehow understand commercial awareness very effectively and try to bring it into action and use it for our benefit. As a part of our last set of questions, I would like to ask you a question, I think, which is running through the minds of every legal aspirant who's getting into the industry sometime in the future, is how exactly is this pandemic when it comes to, because in India also we apply to a lot of vacation schemes in international law firms, and we look forward to such opportunities. And have you observed any change in the trends when it comes to the effect of this pandemic, the relations that are now developing, any of the change that you might have observed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd need much more than 30 minutes or whatever it is we've got to fully break it down. But I think the biggest and probably most obvious one that I think it's kind of challenged is the idea of remote flexible working. So, law firms for the most part, may have had some form of work at home policy 1 day a week, for example, or kind of beginning to explore a degree of kind of flexible working for their employees, but it wasn't really brought forward as a kind of industry-wide movement. And I think, for the most part, you were expected to be in the office and kind of make that impression. And there is a culture of FaceTime at some firms of having to, look like you're working, even if you're not busy. Again, it's hard. I can't explain why that's the case, but and then obviously COVID-19 comes along, and it's not just a case of, I think we should probably explore remote working. It's like, no, you have 2 weeks in lockdown to ensure that every law firm can work remotely and service your clients. And of course, when firms do that, they go, okay, right, we need to get our act together and try this. And when they do, they realize that, actually, we're managing to still speak to clients. We're managing to still collaborate for the most part as a team. And whilst there are absolutely certainly people who want to go back to the office and meet in person, and will miss the social side of working in offices and collaborations, it hasn't derailed our business, and we're still able to provide legal advice and collaborate in some way. And there are, people in my firm who have started their training contracts remotely and still kind of progressing through seats and getting work that way. So I think going forward and thinking about what this is going to mean post-pandemic, it's going to clearly give some kind of weight to the argument that lawyers don't necessarily need to be in the office 5 days a week all the time in order to be effective and kind of do their work. And that will mean many things, especially for working parents who want that flexibility to be with their children, or allow greater flexibility in terms of who is able to work within the profession. I think my only caveat and thing that would be important to bear in mind is that generally studies show that whenever remote working is introduced in a workplace, if everyone is remote working as we are now, it has no impact on kind of the importance of FaceTime or needing to make an impression on your boss. But if 80% of the company are working remotely, and those 20% of people are working in the office, and in that 20% of people are the people who make decisions about promotions and hiring and the influential sort of managers and things, then unfortunately, as a result, I think, of our own cognitive biases, we look at the person who is quote unquote turning up to the office each day, and kind of you're able to see their impact in person versus kind of through an email or through a screen. It tends to impact rates of promotion and how we kind of value employees contributing to the business. So I think it's certainly something to be kind of following as well. And also what's interesting about law is that, historically we've had to kind of rely on geographical places for a lot of what lawyers do. We have to attend a court, or we have to meet to negotiate this document in a meeting room or something like that. And especially as a result of technology, and obviously as a result of this pandemic, that's becoming less the case by necessity, with courts having to go online, or, contracts being negotiated by AI or through some other kind of interface or system. And again, it's a question of, okay, how much of this is actually going to stick around once this lockdown is over and we are back to, quote, the new normal. But again, it's whether or not that phrase is even going to be accurate. So I think that's probably the biggest aspect of how this pandemic is going to affect things.
Well, I believe, as you spelled out, that the entire pandemic is actually changing the entire diaspora as to the understanding of the people, understanding of the law firms as well, courts, everything are just evolving with time. And this is quite very important for the law students also to somehow adapt and learn with the changes and grow with the entire process. We've seen, as a last question of mine, is that you've actually come up with a lot of ventures that we all know about. More from Law is a wonderful podcast, and we can learn from that. You've been engaged with virtual networking hubs, you've been engaged with virtual litigation schemes. A lot of things are coming up. Is there any other venture of yours that the law students can really benefit from?
Yeah, so obviously the podcast and my LinkedIn, I do my best to kind of share resources that way. My website sort of provides some blogs and insights and resources that you can check out for free. There's different resources there, and it's currently undergoing a bit of maintenance to try and make this whole process a bit more nicely spelled out for people to find it. But for now, I think the podcast is the main element that you can hopefully get some information, and I always welcome any suggestions as to the types of episodes or guests or talking points that people want to see.
Well, that is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Harry, for taking time out. I think we've had a wonderful conversation. This conversation is going to benefit so many people who are going to tune into the podcast and learn about commercial awareness and from your legal journey and learn about all these changes that are happening. Thank you so much for taking time out. I had a wonderful time. I hope you had a good time too.
No, it was fantastic. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, before we end this conversation, I have to ask you this because you live in London. So I'm going to take this benefit of the doubt. Are you a football fan?
I am. Not a Liverpool fan, though. An Arsenal fan, unfortunately.
How sad are you with this development that we are observing in the last couple of days?
It's been weird because the whole kind of season got put on pause, and I think even Liverpool fans are upset in a way that they can't obviously celebrate the way that they probably wanted to. And so, looking forward to the next season and waiting to see where that goes for now. But,
Right. Well, one thing Manchester United fans won't forget this season for two major reasons. One is COVID-19 and the second is Liverpool. But yes, anyway, I love to rub their noses. Like I love teasing Manchester United fans these days. Well, thank you so much, Harry. I think I had a wonderful time. Thank you so much for helping me out with this conversation. Thank you so much for helping our listeners with all these concepts. I look forward to being in touch with you and learn more and more from your experiences.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you.